Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Puris, coming to you from Baltimore. I'm speaking to David Bacon about immigration policy this election season. David Bacon is an award-winning photojournalist, author, and immigrant rights activist who spent over 20 years as a labor organizer. His most recent book is The Right to Stay Home: How U.S. Policy Drives Mexican Migration. David, thank you so much for joining us again.
My pleasure.
So, David, this election season, Bernie Sanders is perhaps looking like the most reasonable when it comes to immigration policy. So I want you to pretend you're one of his advisors and give us a sense of how he can up his game when it comes to immigration policy.
Well, first, I want to give Bernie Sanders credit for something that I think is very, very important. And that is that on his website, he says that he recognizes that the North American Free Trade Agreement and that our trade policy is resulting in migration to the United States. It displaces people. And he even says that the number of migrants from Mexico coming to the United States during the 20 years of the North American Free Trade Agreement increased by what he says is 185%. Actually, I think the increase is even more than that. That is the first time I have heard somebody on a national stage in the U.S. political process recognizing what is one of the most important truths. And what it really means is that we need, in order to deal with migration, we need to look at what the U.S. does abroad, both in terms of trade policy and in terms of intervention policy. And for Hillary Clinton, I think this is a big problem because she is not critical, essentially, of our trade policy. And in fact, she has advisors in her campaign. I was reading a recent article in the New York Times, which I think was inspired by the Clinton campaign, critical of Sanders' proposals on single-payer healthcare, and one of the people that they trotted out was this guy, Auden Goolsbee. And Auden Goolsbee, we might remember from the 2008 campaign when Obama was saying publicly that he was going to oppose the North American Free Trade Agreement because of its impact on workers in the U.S. And Mr. Goolsbee, the economist, then went to Canada and assured the Canadian government, don't worry about it. He doesn't really mean it. We're not going to touch NAFTA if he's elected. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. So I think that on this one, Sanders gets it right and Clinton gets it wrong.
But I think, can I ask you something just
Sure.
to clarify? You cited in a Truth Out article that Bernie Sanders suggested that the open border policy was really a Koch brothers policy. Can you give us some clarity on what exactly Bernie said and the problem with that?
Well, I think that what Bernie was referring to was that employers want a policy in which they have access to a lot of cheap labor. And I think this was a very unfortunate remark for him to make, because what it really should have done was it should have criticized the guest worker programs in these very organized ways in which employers seek to recruit and bring workers to the United States in very vulnerable position. And talking about the open border policy, I mean, well, first of all, there is no open border. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't be deporting 400,000 people a year. But it's also sort of, it could be interpreted to say that that the migration of undocumented people is something that we ought to try and stop with enforcement and by deportations and so forth, because employers are going to employ workers who don't have papers at low wages. And the solution to low wages is to organize unions and to raise the wages. It's not to basically say that the workers then should be deported because they're basically in a very vulnerable situation. So immigration enforcement is not an answer to the problem of low wages. The answer to the problem of low wages is what Bernie himself says, which is, fight for 15, raise the wages, strengthen unions, and so forth. Bernie
How
Sanders.
should the candidates be addressing this issue? Now, perhaps Bernie was referring to the fact that sometimes extreme right-wing people advocate for open borders because free-flowing labor drives the price of labor down, and some very conservative members have supported that policy.
Well, I think it's become kind of like you know, a manipulated issue in a way, or at least the words are. The only Republican source I think that uses those words and says that they're for it is the Wall Street Journal, and does that for exactly the reasons you're saying. They say an open border policy essentially means that the U.S. economy becomes, as they would say in their coded language, more competitive. In other words, wages go down. Now, it's true that if workers are working at low wages, what it does is it sort of puts a limit on all workers. It's employers use the threat of low wages against workers who are getting more by essentially saying to people, look, in union negotiations, for instance, you should accept what we're offering. We're going to cut your medical care. We want to cut your wages. And if you don't like it, there are a lot of people out there who are willing to work for less than you are. This is, wage competition, and this has been part of capitalism, is part of the way our country has functioned from the very beginning. And so the progressive answer that unions have had to this, and basically it does, what employers are trying to do is they are trying to make workers feel very fearful about their jobs, so fearful that they will not ask for very much. And so the answer that our labor movement has historically had to that, especially the progressive parts of our labor movement, is to say that what we need to do then is we need to get workers together, and we're going to go to employers together, and we are going to demand what we want, and we are going to fight to ensure that all workers have rights. And so if we have undocumented people, for instance, who are vulnerable, say, because of our deportation policy. After all, if we're deporting 400,000 people a year, anybody in their right mind is going to feel very worried about their status if they don't have papers. So we need to stop the deportation policy. We need to ensure that everybody in our workplace have rights and are able to stand up and advocate for themselves. And if we have an immigration policy, which we do, that makes people vulnerable, then we need to change that policy. And this is one place where I think the Sanders campaign really needs to think about it seriously. So does Hillary Clinton. And that is, they both are calling for what they're saying are making our policy called E-Verify function more fairly. Now, E-Verify is an enforcement policy that takes place at work, on the job. And what it does is it requires employers to check the immigration status of workers, and then the government comes in and essentially forces employers to fire workers if they don't have legal status. That makes people feel very fearful and very afraid. It makes it hard for people to organize unions. It gets used against workers when they do try to organize unions. And it is an enforcement policy that cannot be reformed. There is no way to make the firing of people over their immigration status softer, so that people are not going to fear. You either are going to fire people because of their immigration status, or you are not. And it is in the interest of workers here that we have as much security and as many rights as we can in the workplace. So simply saying that we need to kind of make sure that we only fire people in a fair way is not a solution here.
Hillary Clinton is on record saying that she supports comprehensive immigration policy. What does she mean by that, and what is on the table to be negotiated in terms of comprehensive immigration policy?
Comprehensive immigration policy essentially is the name for the kind of immigration bills we've seen in Congress over the last several years. And they're sort of three-part bills. So one part is the legalization part for people who are here as undocumented people, and there's a lot of variation in how that gets treated. So some of the proposals for legalizing people legalize almost everybody, and some only legalize a very small percentage of people. But that's the part that most immigrant communities want to have is people need legalization, they need legal status. But the other two parts of those bills, one part, and we've been talking about them, one part is increased enforcement. So that E-Verify program, firing people at work, that increases under comprehensive immigration reform. And then the guest worker programs, these contract labor programs that bring people to the U.S. in this very vulnerable situation, that also increases under these comprehensive bills. That's why they're called comprehensive, is because they include all of these elements. And so really, these bills, if you go back and you look at what the origin of these bills were, they were originally written by employers as labor supply bills. In other words, to say we need to expand guest worker programs, and in order to make these programs function well, we need to have a lot of enforcement, so that we're going to force people to come to the United States that way. That's why we have these big enforcement provisions in those bills, including enforcement at the border. And then it's sort of like a carrot that gets dangled in front of people and say, if you agree to these things, then we'll give you a little bit of legalization or a little bit more of legalization, depending on the bill. So I think that when Bernie Sanders said in 2007 that he was against that comprehensive immigration reform bill, he was saying something that was very important, which is, I am against these guest worker programs. This is, something that is manipulated by employers, that employers want. We're not against immigrants, but we want people to be able to have rights here in the United States as workers. And guest workers don't have rights. That's why these programs exist. When he voted for Senate Bill 744 later on, I think that was kind of going backwards, really, because in a sense it was saying, I accept the deal, this trade-off. And Hillary Clinton has always been in favor of the deal. I think maybe partly because she thinks that legalization is a good idea, but really mostly because she thinks employers should be giving workers under these guest worker programs, and also is in favor of increased enforcement. And even though she's sort of trying to soften her position on enforcement now somewhat, historically speaking, Hillary Clinton has been very much in favor of immigration enforcement. That's why it's kind of hard to figure out what she would do if she were president. I think that Bernie Sanders is more predictable, but I think that he should stick to his guns. He should stick to the progressive positions that he's taken in the past, and also really look at the real life impact of things like increased enforcement, especially increased enforcement at work.
David Bacon, the author of the book, The Right to Stay Home, How U.S. Policy Drives Mexican Migration. David, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.